Well, good evening, everybody. I am very, very happy to be here, and we're up here a lot. Just not you don't know it because it's usually during when y'all are at work. We come up here a lot of times, and so we're in the building a lot of times, and up here on site as much as we can. So it's nice to kind of get to be here. Actually during service times, and not just on a one-off, because I've been here several times over the years, just kind of maybe the lectureship or a homecoming or something like that. So it's nice to kind of get to be here for VBS and have a few days, and we're not kind of a rush, because, you know, honestly, on a Sunday or something like that, those are hectic. You know, Sundays are hectic days, and you just don't get to talk to most people. So I'm hoping by the end of the week we'll at least get to spend some time with everybody. And there's several of you that I don't know. There's a lot of new faces here from when I was here. So hopefully get to know you a little bit as well. Case was talking about how some of you may know me better than you know him. You got to remember, his memory doesn't go back as far as ours does. Case has almost been here his whole life, really and truly. He was born on Friday, September the 12th, and his first time attending services here was Sunday night, September the 14th. Jade came, she got released from the hospital on Sunday morning, and she and Case made their first visit here to this service, this assembly, on Sunday night when he's 2 days old. So he's just about been in this place his whole life. So this ought to feel normal and comfortable for him. All right, so here's what we're going to be doing this week. As you can see up from on the screen, we're going to be talking about parables this week. And I'll just tell you right now, tonight, we're not going to look at any one particular parable. We'll do that Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. But tonight, we're going to kind of try to set the stage a little bit for parables, because we all bring preconceived ideas. We all have preloaded thoughts about different things, and sometimes those are true and good. Sometimes they're inaccurate, and they can make things more difficult. So before we actually get into actually studying any of the parables, I want us to talk a little bit about how to approach parables. This isn't a bad thing that we do this, but it can limit us as we become adults. When we think about parables, the way that we approach parables is usually on the little kid Sunday school level, like what's going on back there right now. And that's good. I mean, that's kind of how we introduce young people to ideas and concepts. We focus on general themes and big ideas, morals of a story, that kind of thing. And it makes these things accessible to it's hard to teach theology to a 4-year-old, is what I'm trying to say. So we usually ease them in with things that they can grasp. But now here's the problem. A lot of times we never mature beyond that in our studying of the Scriptures. And that's especially true maybe of the parables more than any other part of the Bible, because we learn these stories when we're little kids, and because we know them. If I were to just shout out a random parable right now, chances are most everybody in this room, maybe even everybody in this room, could tell me, here's what that parable's about, or here's the lesson, the moral of the story. I'm not saying that's bad, I'm not saying that's not even true. But let's be honest, if I don't get any more out of a parable than I got when I was 5 years old, why even study it? I mean, if I learn all I need to know about the parable of the sower, prodigal son, when I'm 5 years old, then what incentive do I have to even approach and engage with that parable again the rest of my life? And here's the reality. We generally don't. Simply because we go, oh yeah, I know the parable, I know the prodigal son story, I know that story, I know what it's about, I know the lesson, so we don't ever re-engage with it. And I think that's a shame, I think it's a tragedy. Because as we grow and mature and as we develop and as our understanding and our just, and I'm not even talking about spiritual, biblical understanding, I'm just talking about our understanding as human beings, as adults, as we mature, what we see when we look at those stories will change. Simple question. When you were 16 years old It was Friday night. Your curfew was, I don't know what it was, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, midnight, whatever it was. Were you ever ready to come home at curfew time? Did you always push it right up to the edge? Maybe even see if you could get grace by just stepping over the line 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Now don't lie, because most of your mamas or daddies are here and I'll check on you and they'll tell the truth on it. When you're 16 years old, you're thinking, why can't I stay out till 3 o'clock in the morning? I'm just hanging out with my friends. We're just laughing, having a good time. Why can't I do that? Let me ask you a question. When you're 50 years old and you have a 16-year-old, do you think about it the same way that you did when you were 16? There's things you understand as a 50-year-old that you can't explain to a 16-year-old no many times you tell them. But you just got to let a little time happen and usually become parents and experiences in life, and then suddenly things become crystal clear. The same is true with our approach to these stories that we've heard our whole lives, that we're so familiar with, that we first get introduced to in VBS when we're little kids. And what we learned when we were little kids is still true and good. But what we might see when we're 50 years old might be much deeper and richer, much broader. That's why we're going to study parables this week. Now, whenever I say stories, sometimes people get uncomfortable with that word. They don't like the word Bible story. I've had people before say, I don't like that. And the reason they don't like it is they have the misconception that story implies that it's not real or true or something like that. And so if that makes you uncomfortable, I'll use the word narrative instead, which narrative is just a synonym for story, but narrative, if it makes us feel a little bit more comfortable. But when it comes to storytelling, I know there are a lot of teachers that go to this congregation. A lot of teachers in the audience right now. I'm talking about like public school teachers and then, of course, Bible class teachers. And I feel safe in saying that if I were to ask you personally, what is your take or what is your opinion on, that you would agree that storytelling is one of the most powerful and memorable means of teaching. Neuroscientists tell us that our brains are literally wired for storytelling. That our capacity to learn, to remember, to understand. Will you advance this for me? Because apparently it's not. Oh, that's because I turned it off. Okay, never mind. Red means stop, right? Green means go. All right, let's try this again. All right, we're working now. All right. Storytelling is a powerful way to teach because our brains are wired for storytelling. Let's do a little experiment, and I think it'll demonstrate the point. Do you remember the basic premise, the basic story, and the moral of the story to Hansel and Gretel? What about the little boy who cried wolf? Little Red Riding Hood? Jack and the Beanstalk? Now, I'll ask you a question. When was the last time you actually read, heard, or told that story? Probably a long time, right? And yet, you remember what every one of those stories, and I could go down a list of a bunch more. You remember what the point of those stories are. You remember how the story goes. Now, you may not remember every specific little detail, and you might skip a part, but everybody in here remembers the general plot to those stories. And ultimately, the point of those stories. And that's the point. The point is you remember the point of the stories, even though you haven't heard them maybe in decades. And the reason is because stories are powerful forms of teaching. That's the power of stories. You can be told a story when you are a child and never hear it again for decades and still remember the point. So is it any surprise then that Jesus, who is the master teacher, would employ in His teaching what is one of the most powerful vehicles for conveying truth in a memorable and easily applicable way than telling stories? If you take the Bible and you analyze it kind of statistically of the teachings of Jesus, about 35% of Jesus' teaching was parables. I mean, we're looking at 1/3. So for every 3 times in the Bible that you're reading where Jesus is speaking, He's telling a story in one of those. Okay, so that should stand out to us alone at the power and importance of storytelling. Let's talk a little bit about this word parable. Our English word parable, it's not a translation. Now, we all know that our Bible wasn't written in English. If you're talking about the New Testament, it was written in the Greek language. And so this word parable in our English language, it's actually not a translation. It's what's called a transliteration. And all that means is they take the original word and they give it an English ending. So this word parable that is used in our Bibles that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all use, this word parable, it literally means to cast alongside. That's what the word means. All right, so what's the word trying to convey? Definitions really aren't useful if we don't have applications of them. So what is the idea being conveyed by this word that means to cast or lay or place alongside? Well, the idea is you're putting 2 things beside each other so that you can look at them and learn things by compare and contrast. We do this all the time, by the way, when we get dressed. Maybe you go pull something out. Maybe you pull a suit out of the closet, a few shirts, a couple of ties. You lay them on the bed, you hang them up on the door, you hold them up, and you kind of look and you hold up this shirt with this. That doesn't really go with it. You put some things together and you try to find something that looks good together. That's the idea of what a parable is doing. It's taking these stories and it's laying them alongside these ideas of these eternal principles and truths, this spiritual truth, these concepts of the kingdom of God, and it's delivering them to us in a vehicle. That's what the story is. It's a vehicle to deliver this truth to us. It's delivering it to us in a vehicle that makes it easily accessible, that makes certain things stand out and become apparent. And you can even see it like the word para. You know, every one of us driving here tonight probably drove by double yellow lines, parallel lines. They run alongside each other. That's parable. These 2 things that are put alongside one another. And there's a lot of them in the Bible. When we think about parables, we usually think about the New Testament, but there's actually at least 26 parables in the Old Testament. And the reason I say at least is because sometimes it's tricky to define what exactly is a parable. Is this a parable or is this an illustration? Is this a parable or is this a metaphor? And so sometimes there's some debate on, does this qualify as being a parable or not? But there's at least 26 of them in the Old Testament. Now here's the kind of, oh, thank you for doing that, by the way. The guys in the booth go, hey, you're supposed to be on the next slide now. That may happen a lot. Stay on guard back there is all I can tell you. When we think about the parables of the Old Testament, they're delivered most of the time by the prophets. Now here's something interesting about parables. They're not always oral, spoken. The Old Testament prophets especially were really keen at using what's called prophetic theater. They would act out the parable. They wouldn't say it. They wouldn't talk. They would remain silent. But their actions kind of pantomimed what was being said. By the way, we do this all the time too. You ever been sitting in services? I don't know, when I was a kid, Mark, Heather, this is where the teens sat, right? Remember? This is where the teenagers sat, right here. So that meant that, everybody in the auditorium could see the teenagers. And sometimes, believe it or not, I know this is going to be hard to believe. Sometimes me and Mark didn't pay attention during church. We might talk or pass notes or, cut up or whatever. I know it's hard to believe, but we did that sometimes. And every now and then, you might be acting up a little bit and you kind of look over your shoulder and you see your mama sitting maybe over here somewhere and you get this. That's what prophetic theater was. If I look at you and I go, you know what that means. And so some of those parables were not spoken. They were actually acted out like that. Isaiah and Ezekiel, they really loved to do that. But then a lot of them, of course, were spoken. Now, when we think about the parables of the New Testament, there's at least 28 of them. Kind of like the old, it's hard to define some of them, is this a parable or not? There's at least 28 of them. And here's the thing. If you want a book, if you want to read parables, the Gospel of Luke is your book. There are 24 parables in the Gospel of Luke. And 18 of those are unique to Luke, meaning you're not going to read them in Matthew, Mark, or John. Luke is the only one who records it. So there's a lot of parable teaching in the New Testament. But now, what is a parable? I'm just going to tell you right now, let's get rid of this idea. Not because it's bad or wrong, but because it's elementary. This is what we tell children. This is not a children's class. We're grown-ups. It's time to move on from milk to strong meat. We sometimes tell children that a parable is an earthly story with a spiritual application. And that's true. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just saying that's elementary. That's good for kids. So what is a parable then? What's the purpose of a parable? What are parables trying to accomplish? I want to suggest to you that a parable is an invitation to us to go on a spiritual journey where we're going to be challenged in ways that we never have before and ways that we may not even see coming. They're open narratives that invite us to engage with them. Not just to listen to the story, but to think, to ponder, to contemplate. Parables are meant to be ingested and chewed on kind of like a cow does its cud. Okay? Y'all know how cows work, right? I don't have to explain all that. But when they chew their cud, that's part of their digestive process. That's part of taking the food in, the nourishment, and digesting it so that they can benefit from it. And what I'm suggesting is these kingdom teachings that are very different from the culture and world that we exist in. They're not always just so simple and easy to see as on the surface. Sometimes they are. But sometimes there's much deeper nuance, subtleties that have to be digested slowly over time. So don't just pick up the parable of the prodigal son. We're going to look at that this week. We're not going to look at it tonight. We're going to look at it this week. You read the story of the prodigal son, and by the way, that's not a parable. That is part of a parable. We sometimes say Luke 15, there's 3 parables: the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. If you read the text very carefully, it says Jesus spoke this parable unto them, and then he tells them those 3 stories. They are 3 scenes in one story. It's all one story, and he gives us 3 settings in this same story. But we go, okay, the parable of the prodigal son. We know what that's about, right? The message, it's a real simple story. No matter how far away from God you go, if you'll come back, God will always receive you back. And you know what? That's a true statement. And that's why we teach it to those little kids back there. Because we want them to understand that at a very early age before they start making some really big, bad, silly, dumb, hurtful mistakes. We want them to know there's always a path for redemption back to the heart of God. Always. But that's not what that parable's about. Now, if you want to know, well, then what's it about? Come back Tuesday night and we'll talk about it. All right, we'll get into it. We'll dive into it. We'll really get into it. There's more going on than that. Because see, if that's all the story is about, let me ask you an honest question. Why do any of us need to reread, study that text anymore? We just said what the story's about. We already know it, right? So why reread it? Why engage with it? Because there are layers to that story that you're not going to see when you're 12. And you're not going to see easily when you're 50. But if you'll take it in and chew on it, you will gain spiritual nourishment from that story that you've never gotten before. and that you can only get by spending time with the text. It's that simple. Parables are mysterious and difficult because they challenge us to look at the hidden parts of our lives. And with that being said, look, I remembered. Parables are covert delivery systems. What they do is they tell these stories that are able to sneak past our defense systems. All of us walk around with walls. All of us walk around with defense mechanisms. Our brains are literally wired for that purpose. And it's important because it helps us to survive. It protects us from a lot of things that would kill us or do us real serious harm. So that's useful. It's good for us. But it can also be a negative. See, there's a fine line between a fortress and a prison, isn't it? You know, just as it may be built to keep people out, it can also wind up keeping us in. And so what parables do is they're able to sneak under our defenses or over our defense. They can get past our defense systems so that the seed of truth can be implanted in our heart. And once the seed of truth becomes implanted in the heart, it will wreak havoc on your life. There is no hiding from it at that point. So what do we try to do? We try to deflect it and block things. Now, what are our defense mechanisms? Generally speaking, we have two defense mechanisms, pride and prejudice. Pride is we already think we know what we need to know and we don't need any new information. We're good. I'm good. Thanks, but no thanks. I'm good. And so there's a lot of things that someone tries to approach us and make a suggestion or maybe point out something, and our pride, stop right there, and our pride shuts it down. So something that would be productive never gets to our heart because our pride, that sentinel goes to work and stops it in its track. And when pride doesn't do it, prejudice often does. Now when I say prejudice, here's what I mean. Prejudice is a filter. Okay? As information comes to us, our preconceived thinking, that's what prejudice is. We've already made up our mind. And so as this information comes to us, our prejudice will kind of filter it out so that it never can get to our heart. And the beauty of stories, parables, is that they can subvert our defense mechanisms, so that this powerful seed that is the truth of God's Word can be implanted in our heart. And once that happens, it can begin to grow and break open things that have been calcified in my conscience and my soul for a long, long time. And you can see sometimes radical transformation happen instantaneously with some people. I don't know of a better example of this happening than 2 Samuel chapter 12. 2 Samuel chapter 12, you even know chapter 11, it's infamous. David, the sin with Bathsheba. In chapter 12, the prophet Nathan is tasked with holding David accountable. That's what prophets really did. The prophets were checks and balances on the king and on the people. They were God's voice to hold them accountable for breaking and violating the covenant. Now I want to ask you a question. Imagine this scenario. We've got chapter 11 and now chapter 12, God sends Nathan. And by the way, prophets were more than that. Prophets were advisors to the king. They gave him advice and counsel. They shared wisdom with them. The prophets were also kind of like lawyers. Like their job was to say, the king wants to do something, and the prophet's job was like, yeah, that's illegal. You can't do that. Now, when I say illegal, keep in mind what their law was. They were a theocracy, so the law was what has God said on the matter. And so they say, hey, God said you can't do that. That's against God's law. So God sends this prophet Nathan to confront David on what he's done. Now, imagine that Nathan walks into the king's courtroom, walks into his throne room, and he says to the king, okay, so you have broken the law of God by lusting, coveting your neighbor's wife, adultery, murder, and concealment. What do you think would have happened if he approached David and just kind of read off his charges to him? Let me ask you this. When the cabinet members or the lawyers or the advisors to a president comes to them and says, okay, you broke this law and you broke this law and you broke this law and you can't do this because it's illegal. Let me ask you a question. How does that usually go? Usually we see a little blurb on our news screens telling us that so-and-so has been fired or has been replaced. Now there's a reason for that. Because when you directly confront someone with their wrongdoing, they have defense mechanisms that start swatting those accusations and charges away. All of us do that. People who are in very, very powerful positions can do it better than anybody. If he had approached David like that, at best, he would have probably been removed from the king's court. At worst, he would have probably been executed. Because if he had come to David and had said, here's what you've done, can you imagine David saying something like this? Hey, I'm the king. I'm the Lord's anointed. I can do anything that I want. If I want this wife, then I can take her. If I want to kill this guy, I can kill him. I have that power. That's my role as the king. I can do whatever I want. I command the armies. I don't answer to anybody. That's probably the response he would have gotten. So he doesn't approach David like that. Instead, he says, David, I want to tell you a story. There's these two guys. One of them's rich, one of them's poor. One of them, he has got flocks and herds all over Judea. The other one, he has one lamb. He doesn't have a flock, he has a lamb. And he loves this thing. It's like family to him. He loves it like it's his daughter. He carries it around with him. He kisses it. It eats at his table with it. Any of y'all got dogs that you let share your food with? All right, then maybe you can relate a little more to the story. And he said this rich man had a guest show up one day. And rather than send one of his shepherds out to take one of his flock and prepare this lamb and feed it to his, he actually takes his neighbor's, that one little lamb that he has, he takes it and he has it killed and prepared and fed to his neighbor. And David loses his mind. The first thing out of David's mouth is, we ought to kill that guy. His reaction is vengeance. That guy deserves to die. His second one is justice. Isn't that often how we are too? Our first reaction to a wrongdoing is we want revenge. We want somebody to suffer. We want them to be punished. We want them to hurt. And then maybe we calm down a little bit and say, okay, let's go with justice instead. And so David says he's going to repay what he took fourfold. He took one lamb, he's got to give back four. Now David's not just pulling that number out of the air. He's actually quoting the law of Moses there. But see, the law of restitution in the covenant with Moses said that if you stole your neighbor's sheep, you didn't have to give him a sheep back. If you killed his sheep, you didn't have to give him back a sheep. You had to give him back four. And we understand that in our today too. We have that same principle. If somebody were to T-bone you in your car and it destroyed your car and you got injured and maybe had to have surgery, your insurance would sue their insurance company, and in the lawsuit they would say, okay, you got to pay to fix the car, you got to pay for the medical bills, you got to pay for the time that they lost income from losing work, and then they have this thing, you ever heard this thing? And then there's this punitive number that is pain and suffering. Okay, that's the idea of the fourfold. Look, you didn't just take a lamb. When you took that from him, you wounded him in a bigger way than just taking one possession, and so you got to pay it back. Why do you think David reacted so strongly? Remember what David's job was before it was king? David was a shepherd, wasn't he? Shepherds spend more time with sheep than they do people. Shepherds sleep with the sheep, eat with the sheep, travel with the sheep. Their whole lives are spent with sheep. And we know from all throughout the Bible that they knew each sheep by name, and that the sheep knew them by voice. And so they could call one particular sheep, and that sheep would come running to them. David is the one who sat down and said, how do I describe my relationship with the Creator of heaven and earth? And David said, I know how to describe this. The Lord is my shepherd. He told David a story about sheep. And you know what happened? It snuck right by David's defense. Because after David says all of that, Nathan utters 4 words, you are the man. David doesn't get angry. David doesn't throw him out. David doesn't threaten him. David doesn't defend his actions. He doesn't make excuses. He doesn't go, yeah, but you don't understand. David says, I have sinned. See, that parable, that story, enabled this kingdom truth to subvert David's natural defense mechanisms and plant in his heart. And when it happened, when the seed gets into the heart, transformation begins to take place. You can take a package of seeds, put them on a shelf, and leave them there for hundreds, in some cases we've known even thousands of years, and nothing will happen. But the moment you take that seed and you put it in the dirt, something starts happening. So when we do read that parable of the sower, we're not going to do that one this week, but when we do read that parable, that helps us to understand the part of the story where the sower sows the seed, and some of it falls on hard ground, and the seed can't penetrate. It just sits there. In other words, it can't get past that defense mechanism. Now, when Jesus explains it, He says, that's what it's like when Satan tries to steal away the Word from the hearts of people, because he knows that if the seed can get in the heart, then transformation can take place. So he doesn't want the seed to get in the heart. And when it gets in the heart, things begin to happen. Now, depending upon the condition of the heart, will determine how much and what happens, But parables are covert delivery systems to sneak the truth past our natural defenses, things like our pride and our prejudice, so that the power of the kingdom truth can do its work once it makes its home in our hearts. We mistakenly label them earthly stories with heavenly meanings. They are very much that, but they're also grounded in the world here and now. And they often contrast how things are with how things are supposed to be. Very often Jesus begins His parables with these phrases. Unto what shall I liken the kingdom of heaven? And then He tells a story. Or, the kingdom of heaven is like unto, and then He tells a story. Now, what's He doing when He's telling that story? He's saying, okay, here's what things are like. You know what things are like. But in this story, He's going to take you on a journey that if you'll let Him, He'll say, but here's how things are supposed to be like. This is what it looks like when God rules in the kingdoms of men, when God rules in the hearts of men. It looks like this. So parables, they kind of give us handles that we can grab onto to help us understand what Jesus is trying to teach us about His kingdom. Because everything that Jesus tries to teach us about His kingdom is not automatically obvious and easy for us. You and I were born into a world that is turned upside down. You sometimes hear people talk about the upside down nature of the kingdom. I don't like that language because the kingdom's not upside down. It's this fallen world that is upside down. At the end of Genesis chapter 1, everything is very good. In Genesis chapter 3, when humans rebel against the will and wisdom of God, that they learn through His Word being delivered to them, when they do that, suddenly they turn everything upside down. Everything is turned on its head, and chaos ensues. Ever since Genesis 3, God has been working out His plan, and He ultimately works it out through Jesus, how to take this upside-down world and turn it back right again. And the kingdom of God is how that happens. That's why the kingdom of God doesn't make sense to people who have not allowed the seed to make it into their hearts. There is not a scenario in our world where it makes any good sense to love your enemy and do good to people who hate you. There is not any sense in this world where it's rational to make yourself the servant of all people and to forgive those who have wronged you no matter how they've wronged you. Our world doesn't work like that, does it? Let me ask you a question. How's that working out for us? Our world is upside down. It's got everything backwards and messed up. These parables give us a handle so that we can begin the climb to setting things, at least in our life, right. The way they're supposed to look in the kingdom. They're a lens that shows us the truth, that corrects our distorted vision. Since the last time I've been here, these are new. I can't read anymore without glasses. I can't read something up here without glasses. Now, the only problem with these particular glasses is I can't see you if I got them on. Y'all have all been blurry the whole time. So if I've been like preaching to the wall and didn't realize it's because I can't really see you good. But I'm grateful for these because I can't read my notes otherwise. These lenses correct my vision, and parables are corrective lenses that can help us see what is true in a world of illusion, in a world of deception. They're meant to awaken us, to stimulate our conscience, and ultimately move us to action. They've been told many, many times, and they're often told differently from one time to the next. And they were very commonly known. Here's something that maybe you didn't know. A lot of the parables of Jesus actually are not original with Jesus. I think we just assume that Jesus made these stories up. But that's not always the case. In fact, some of the parables that Jesus told, we have like archaeological discoveries now of the telling of parables with the same basic premise that go back to Egypt in 2400 BC. So here's what I want you to think about when you think about how these parables were used by rabbis. Every rabbi would take these stories. There's a basic premise, and then they would put their own unique twist or spin on the parable. Kind of like this. Think about jokes that we have that all start with the same basic premise. A Muslim, a rabbi, and a priest go fishing. And then finish the joke. That's the setup. The punchline could be any number of 100 different things. Did you hear the one about the blonde? And then finish the joke. All right? And it could be 100 different things. That's how I want you to think about how these parables were. They had certain basic premises that would often be reused. And so if you were a student of one rabbi, he might tell the parable of the sower, but he might make a different application. The end of the parable functions kind of like the punchline of a joke. Don't limit them to a single meaning. To do so is to limit the parable. But even worse, it limits ourselves and how they can affect change in us. Parables are designed to surprise us, challenge us, indict us, shake us up through multiple interpretations and applications. So when you read a parable, look for yourself in the parable. When you read a parable with multiple characters, ask yourself this question: which one of these characters best describes me? And you know what? You might find at one stage in your life, you might feel like the prodigal son in the story. At another point in your life, you might identify more with the older brother. You might get to a point in your life where you feel like the father in the story. So as you read the stories, look for yourself in them and ask yourself this question: how is Jesus seeking to change my actions and my attitudes by telling me this story? What is he trying to convey to me? I guess that means I got to stop. I didn't hear a bell yet, so I'm going to keep going. All right, here's another little thing just to leave you with. Parables usually employ a literary device known as the rule of three. And we see this everywhere that we go. All right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The story of Goldilocks. How many bears are there? How many beds are there? How many types of, bowls of porridge are there? The three little pigs, right? Over and over and over we see this. Stop, drop, and roll. There was a priest, there was a Levite, and there was a Samaritan. Okay? Oftentimes Jesus used this rule of three. There's a lost sheep, there's a lost coin, and there's lost sons. Jesus tells a story about a banquet. One man makes the excuse, I bought land and I got to go look at it. Another says, I bought oxen and I got to go test them. Another says, I've got married. You got three excuses. So a lot of times they use this rule of three. And always read them against the backdrop of the Hebrew Scriptures. If you go to one of the little local plays up here, or even better, VBS, upstairs right now are VBS backdrops that have been used since I was a child. This year, this backdrop might be the story of the prodigal son. Next year, a different teacher pulls it out and puts it up in their room, and it's the Good Samaritan. Same backdrop, but different stories told on that backdrop. So when you read these parables, let your mind be attentive to the question of, where have I seen this backdrop in my Bible before? For example, 5 minutes or is it over? It's over. Okay. Well, I don't hear any kids yet, so we're going to say one more thing. A certain man had two sons. That's the parable of the prodigal son, right? Can you think of any stories in the Old Testament with two sons? Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, Isaac and Ishmael. So when you read these parables, read them against the backdrop of these Old Testament stories. Most of the time, the parables ultimately have this question. Are you listening? Not do you hear, but are you listening? Jesus loved to begin His parables by saying, he that has ears to hear, let him hear. God gave you ears, now use them for their purpose that He created them, so that you can listen. Hopefully, maybe this will be a little bit of help of how we're going to go through the parables this week. Hope it'll spur some interest. I hope somebody will go home tonight and read some of these parables and go, let me look at this through 50-year-old eyes instead of 5-year-old eyes. Tomorrow night, we're going to be looking at Luke 15. We're going to be looking at the lost sheep, the 99 and leaving the one, if you want to read ahead. Thank y'all so much for your time with me tonight.